if you talk to lawyers in the whistleblower space, everybody knows that you were the J.P. Morgan lawyer, not the J.P. Morgan lawyer, the guy who blew the whistle on them. Can you tell us about the J.P. Morgan case?
Well, yeah, it's again a very story of unlikely outcomes. In 2012, a colleague of mine named Chris Toby, he had contacted me. He was a board member of the $12 billion Kentucky state retirement system. He had found out that the state was paying kickbacks to some investment firms, and that some investment firms were paying kickbacks. And so he reported it to the SEC. This is 2012. So he came to me, he said, Ted, I'd like you to be my lawyer, my independent counsel. The pension fund will pay for you to be my independent counsel on this SEC whistleblower matter. And I said to him, with my unique genius, I said, Chris, the SEC whistleblower program is never going to pay anybody anything. I said that this is just a waste of time. But I had a similar view when bottled water came out decades ago. Who would pay money for bottled water?
So your predictions are a little off sometimes.
3 years later, I got the largest award in history, $78 million, 30 from the CFTC and 48 million from the SEC. But my initial take was that this program was just going nowhere. And in his case, the pension fund was investigated by the SEC, but they didn't take any action at the end of their investigation. They should have. The pension fund now is still fighting lawsuits.
So that was the Kentucky pension plan,
right?
The Kentucky teachers or all Kentucky union workers? What?
It was all Kentucky state workers.
All state workers in Kentucky. And now, who was bribing who exactly? What was the allegation?
Well, the allegation was, in that case, I believe, that investment firms were paying influential intermediaries to get themselves hired. So it was
so people who had influence in Kentucky politics were getting paid by the investment firms to get on the list of firms that were managing X billion dollars of Kentucky pension money.
Yes.
Okay.
And by the way, the report I wrote in that case is public. Anybody who wants to look it up can look at it. All of the crowd-funded and investigations I do of state pensions are made public at the end of the investigation. And so there's about them online you can see. So anyhow, my initial prediction that the SEC whistleblower program would be a total waste of time was absolutely wrong.
So Chris Toby was the whistleblower and you were the lawyer?
Yes.
Okay.
But then later, since I do a lot of investigations around the world, things come to my attention on my own, as opposed to having a client that I represent. J.P. Morgan case, I was the whistleblower and the whistleblower lawyer. And so in that case, there were conflicts of interest and hidden fees and the usual things that I look for. And I wrote about them in Forbes and also then turned it into an SEC whistleblower case.
On the Chris Toby case, that settled and you got paid by the SEC for that case?
No, the Chris Toby case, the SEC did not take any action. I got paid, but the pension fund paid me to be his independent counsel initially.
Right, but SEC looked at it and didn't do anything, but you think there was wrongdoing there?
Oh, there's no question there was wrongdoing there. It's just the SEC does not want to get involved in federal and state politics. You cannot get involved in state pension wrongdoing without stumbling into state politics. It's all what I call the politicization of the investment process. The decisions that are made at these state and local pensions are based on politics, the mayor, the governor. And so for the SEC to get involved, you're basically, it's got to be a really egregious situation. They do not want to get involved in state politics.
So would it be accurate to say that there's a level of corruption that's baked in to the political oversight of state pension funds?
Yeah, this is why on Wall Street, state pension funds are called the quote unquote dumbest investors in the room. And there's two reasons for that. One is, like we mentioned earlier, there's no federal regulation of what they do. So it's the Wild West. And Wall Street knows it. You can sell products to state pensions that you can't sell in the corporate pension area. And then the second thing is why this is such a hotbed of corruption. One is lack of regulation. The other one is that these state pension boards, city pension boards, county pension boards, all consist of laymen who have no investment training at all. They're school teachers, firefighters, police, sanitation workers, politicians, union members. None of whom, there's no requirement that they have any financial expertise.
So the people, right? So the people who are really getting the short end of the stick here are the hardworking blue-collar Kentucky people who work for the state and have a pension plan, and they're counting on that pension plan for their old age. And you're telling me that they turn it over to the trust of politicians. Wall Street bankers think those politicians are the dumbest investors in the market, so they sell the worst financial products with the highest fees to these state pension funds because the people who oversee the funds themselves aren't investment experts, but more like political hacks.
Yeah, which brings us to the Minnesota state pension investigation I just completed in September of 2024. In that case, I was hired by 20,000 school teachers in Minnesota. They had a Facebook group called Minnesota Educators for Pension Reform.
Okay.
By the way, this is a new development that I've encouraged, is there are many pensions now have Facebook groups, and those Facebook groups are being better advocates for pension transparency and reform than any union has been for decades now. So the Facebook groups are doing the work to protect workers that unions used to do, but that they don't do when it comes to pensions. So they got together and last April 2024, did a crowdfunding to hire me to investigate the teacher pension fund. And so they raised the money within a month. And so we got started, I think in May. The state freaked out. They sent emails around to all the state agencies saying that this investigation was going to undermine the public confidence in the state system. It has to be stopped. We can't allow this to happen. And amazingly, we got all those emails through a public records request. So I published them all, these warnings about.
I just want to get this straight. So now, Minnesota, you're saying you were hired by the teachers, by the Facebook group teachers, these teachers who were out for pension reform. They hire you. What month in 2024 does this all get started?
March or April
of 2024. The state immediately freaks out and starts sending emails out that you're going to undermine the entire system simply because you're doing an audit on behalf of the very people who pay into the pension system. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And who's the governor? Who's the governor of Minnesota at that point?
At that point is a fellow named Tim Walz.
That's what I thought.
Well known.
Yeah. Wait, so that's the same Tim Walz then who gets tapped to be the VP candidate who's running around America talking about corruption and bad politics, but his state government tried to shut you down almost immediately for the crime of actually asking what happens to our money on behalf of the teachers.
Yeah, and ironically, there was
who support, by the way, the Democratic Party.
Yeah,
that's the irony here. That's what I don't.
Same as in Rhode Island. Supposedly, the Democratic Party does well for teachers, workers. Gina Raimondo did. Tim Walz was in Minnesota. There was a quirk in the public records law, which said if you request information from the state about yourself, then they have to give it to you within 10 days. Usually when I ask for documents from these states, they stretch it out for years.
Right. God forbid you should ask for your own documents.
Yeah. So I asked for documents about myself, and within 10 days, we got these documents from the Attorney General, from the state auditor, from the pension board members saying we've got to stop this investigation. And this was, mind you, Joe, this was before the investigation had been funded. The first email says, wow, the group is trying to raise $75,000. They've already raised $26,000. We got to stop this before, they reach their goal. And fortunately, and the belief was,
oh, wait a second. In 2024, the Attorney General of Minnesota was Keith Ellison.
Here's what happened. So we get hired by the teachers to investigate the teacher retirement system, which has $28 billion in it. Well, it turned out that all the money in the state teachers pension fund was managed by the state pension fund, which is $146 billion pension fund. And that the assets, there were no assets held in the name of the teacher fund. They were all being held in the name of the state fund. So bottom line is the $28 billion investigation of the teacher pension fund pivoted to become a investigation of the $146 billion state pension fund, which nobody knew this at the beginning of this project. And then it turns out that the state pension fund has 3 members of its board. Tim Walz is the chairman as governor. Keith Ellison was on the board as the attorney general. And then I think the state auditor was another person. But so next thing I know, I'm investigating Tim Walz. And then, much to all of our surprise, the report was ready to be issued, was completed in September, and it was in September. I think within the days of the report, Tim Walz was named as the VP candidate. And Tim Walz, when they showed his financial statements, they said, oh my God, this guy really doesn't have much other than his pension wealth. And he admitted he had never bought stock or bond in his entire life. So the chairman of a $146 billion pension fund was Tim
Had never
Walz.
Bought a stock in his life.
Never. Knew absolutely nothing. And
Amazing.
One of the things we said in the report was that the fees were outrageously underreported. Wall Street was getting paid far more. And surprisingly, the pension fund and Tim Walz didn't say a word from September about this investigation, from September to January. No Minnesota media was told not to write about it, and not a single story was written about it, about the investigation in Minnesota media. It was in 2 articles appeared in the New York Post. It was on Fox News, but not a word about this was reported in the Minnesota media.
Because he was the nominee for vice president.
Yeah. And then we just learned that when they finalized their fiscal year-end statements, which was in late December 2024, they changed the numbers. They increased the fees, the disclosed fees by 400%, exactly what my report had said in September. They changed the numbers at the end of December to show a 400% increase. So in the world of financial reporting, a 5% change is regarded by lawyers as being material. A 400%, how do you not notice $350 million a year for 10 years, $3.5 billion?
And the Attorney General and the Governor, Keith Ellison and Tim Walz, are on the board that controls this. How many billions in this fund?
146 billion.
So they control $146 billion, Minnesota's pension money. But the governor who controls this admitted he never bought a stock in his life. The only money he actually had was his own pension from Minnesota.
That, and I think his home, his assets were really like his pension in his home.
And his home. And before your audit, what were the fees that were listed in the public forward statements? What were the fees? You said it went up 400%. Where did it go from what to what?
It went from 84 million to 360 million.
So they were telling the public that the fees paid to manage this multi-billion-dollar fund were 84 million, but in reality, it was 360 million.
That's what they're saying now. My estimate is that it's about 3 times greater. It's over $1 billion. But we got them to go from 84 million.
Well, how does that happen? How can it? They're saying right now today it's 360 million. You're saying it's $1 billion. Why do you say that?
Because they're not counting what is called in the business performance fees. So these fund managers get paid 2% a year to manage the money, plus 20% of the profits.
It's a classic 2 and 20 model, which everyone has. 2% management fees and 20% of what they call the ups, right?
Right. They're not counting.
They don't count the ups?
No. They don't count them. And that amounts to, billions and billions of dollars.
So wait, so they're in essence not telling the full story to the people of their state. Who oversees this? Is there a federal agency that oversees this conduct or this misconduct? Or in this case,
who do you think it would be, Joe?
It should be the federal government, shouldn't it?
It turns out it's the Attorney General. We had to report the Attorney General to the Attorney General.
Wow.
My report was written and submitted to the FBI, the SEC, and the Attorney General of the state of Minnesota. We requested a meeting with him. He said, "What do you want to meet about?" I said, "About this report." And then he canceled the meeting, refused to meet.